Hi, everybody. So now we're going to get into the third lecture about the French Revolution. So far we looked at the causes, we looked at the liberal or the moderate phase, where France became a constitutional monarchy, where the Catholic Church was nationalized, where you start to see the first instances of like the idea of equality for the law taking shape. You see more popular participation and direct action, even by those who are still disenfranchised. Now, we're going to get to the next phase in this lecture, the radical phase, where more extreme elements within French politics take control of the revolution and start to turn it in a slightly different direction, as you might see. So, first of all, though, even during the liberal phase of the French Revolution, other European countries looked on, with interest to see how this would all go. And governments that were still controlled by absolutist monarchies, like Prussia and the Austrian Habsburgs and Russia, they wanted to make sure that this revolution wasn't successful. They were worried that the ideas of revolution might spread into their own countries and spark, their own revolutionary movements. So, in addition, there was an Austrian Habsburg in France, Marie Antoinette. And in 1792, Prussia and Austria, their monarchies together, issue what's known as the Declaration of Pillnitz, where basically they say, listen, French government, do not harm Marie Antoinette. Do not harm her because she's a member of the Austrian dynasty. That'll be like a breach of Austrian sovereignty if you do anything to her, if she's held accountable for anything. So there's a lot of debate about how serious this threat really was. But essentially, they're saying, listen, if anything happens to Marie Antoinette, we're going to go to war against you. So the French government, they weren't quite sure how seriously to take this. But by 1793, you have a more radical government that takes power. And kind of like, without realizing it, Prussia and Austria, they actually set the wheels in motion a little bit for a radical takeover of the French government. Because now, radicals could say, honestly, like, look, these other countries are threatening the rights that we have already won. They're threatening the changes that have already been made. We need to now be ready to defend the revolution. And, there are aristocrats inside of France who are working against you, against the people. So you have this kind of combination of external threats and internal threats that lead the people of France who support the revolution to push for more radical government to deal with these threats accordingly. So, once they're in power, the more radical government, which we're going to talk about in a moment, begins to get France ready for war. So, they pass laws known as the levée en masse, the mass rising, that begins to draft people into the army, conscript people into the army from all levels of society. And the way that they sort of argue for this is by saying that, listen, now the army we're putting together is not just an army that the king puts together for his own interests or that some aristocrats are putting together. This is a truly national army, an army of the people, fighting for the people. So, over the course of a few years, the French government is going to draft a couple 100,000 men into the army. They'll have the biggest army in all of Europe within a few years, way bigger than any other country. So, now, not all Frenchmen are on board with this. There is a lot of resistance and rioting, especially out in the countryside away from Paris, when, agents from the government basically start trying to round people up to get ready to fight. But these laws also put the economy of France in the position to be ready for total war. And basically they'll say that, all of the productive capacity, whether it's producing food or, producing arms or clothing, is going to be ready to be turned toward a war effort if necessary. Now, in 1793 then, the French government actually decides to go to war. They try to go on the offensive. And the first battles between the new French army and the armies of Austria are fought kind of along the frontiers. And for a couple of years, France runs into some big problems because the officers, the commanders of the French army, up until the revolution, were mostly aristocrats. And a lot of those guys had fled the country or, removed themselves from the army and stepped down. So there was kind of a lack of command and experience at the top of the army. But by 1795, though, something interesting has happened, where within this like national army that's emerging, people who are really good, innovative commanders, who are just really like the best at leading troops and putting together innovative ideas and strategies, rise to the top. And that includes leaders like Napoleon Bonaparte when he was still in his 20s. He emerges as a great commander, a really innovative commander, and wins some major battles in the mid and late 1790s that kind of vault him into this level of celebrity and influence. But after 1795, then, France turns the tide, and they start conquering land in, the Low Countries, in Italy, because now they have the biggest army, and they have an army that's actually led by really good commanders, too. So, now in the background of all this, as part of the call to war and the sort of like lead up to war, this is when the Marseillaise is adopted as the anthem of France. And in this moment where like kings from other countries are threatening to like stop the revolution in its tracks, this is the call to arms. To arms, citizens, form your battalions, march, march, their impure blood shall water our lands. So this is why this is such a sort of aggressive and violent anthem, because it's meant to be a defensive call to arms, to protect the rights that you have won as French people. Now, in 1792, though, the government that actually declared war and went to war had become very radical. So in 1792, a new government is formed. The National Assembly is disbanded, and a new government is formed based on elections by universal male suffrage. Now, the way that this had happened, the National Assembly had originally intended for voting rights to be somewhat limited in order to make sure that the government didn't become too radical, that mostly the bourgeoisie and old aristocrats, people who had been aristocratic, were the ones who stayed in power. But by 1792, as the threat of war and rumors about war start to become more and more widespread, and as there's more and more concern within France about like aristocrats working against the revolution, the Paris Commune and the people of the major cities of France become more aggressive in pushing for a radical system in order to deal with these threats. So in 1792, basically the Paris Commune kind of forces the National Assembly to allow more expansive voting to occur and to allow elections based on universal male suffrage. So by the end of 1792, a new representative body is in place that's known as the National Convention, which includes delegates from all levels of society who represent all levels of society, and therefore is going to represent the mass of people who are poor, who are still hungry, who feel like they had been disenfranchised up to this point. And this government very quickly starts making some really big changes. So, now within the National Convention, the political club known as the Jacobins were the most influential group or block of representatives. But within the Jacobins, there was one group that was really among the most extreme, the Mountain. And they were called the Mountain because within the assembly hall where the National Convention actually met, they sat like up in the top benches, like they were sitting on top of a mountain looking down at the rest of the assembly. The two leaders of the Mountain were Maximilien Robespierre, a young lawyer, member of the bourgeoisie, and George Danton, who was kind of an enormous guy, who had like a huge bellowing voice that could just overpower other people in the convention. And Robespierre his nickname was the Incorruptible, because, as violent as the government under his leadership would become, he was someone who was a true believer in what he was doing. Now, once this new government was in power, they abolished the monarchy. They passed a law saying that the monarchy does not exist. We are not a constitutional monarchy anymore. We are a republic, ruled by its citizens, rather than by the monarchy. Now, what starts to happen, though, is that you see this shift in public opinion then against the former monarchs. And within the National Convention, discussions are held about what to do about the old monarchy. And in late 1792, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, they actually try to flee the country because they're worried about their safety, rightfully worried about their safety. But they get stopped at the border, they get returned to Paris, and they get put on trial by the convention as traitors and counter-revolutionaries. And in early 1793, after being convicted, by a very slight margin in the convention, they're both executed. So now, kind of like during the English Civil War back in the 1640s, now the Pandora's box is open. The lid is off. The cats are out of the bag. And this government becomes very extreme very quickly. And this is something that shocks counter-revolutionaries, people who had been kind of on the fence, into becoming very aggressively anti-revolutionary. So, now, during the radical phase, Robespierre and the Mountain and the National Convention, they also throw some bones to the urban poor, to the lowest classes within society. And they pass something called a law of maximum, which finally sets maximum prices on food and other staples of life as well. But this is now meant to give relief to the people in the cities who for years had been asking for something like this in order to, relieve them from hunger and starvation. Now, this is something, though, that landowners out in the countryside, the ones who make the grain in order to be turned into bread, they depend on high prices to support their profits and their prosperity. So this is something that immediately makes the radical government, some more enemies among people out in the countryside. So, now also, people like Robespierre and Danton and, urban bourgeoisie who had this more radical mindset, they wanted to go even farther than the National Assembly had in de-Christianizing France altogether. They thought that the Catholic Church and just Christianity as an institution and a belief system was something that was only going to hold France back, something that was corrupting, something that was too closely associated with the monarchy, with the aristocracy, with the old way of doing things. So they decided that it was time to remove that and start re-educating Frenchmen for a more enlightened, forward-thinking, progressive future. So, they abolished the Catholic Church entirely. So now, even all of the clergy who had taken the constitutional oath, they basically became outlaws as well. And they got rid of the Christian calendar. So no more Christian holidays, no more saints' days or festivals, which, people liked and enjoyed celebrating and gave them, a little relief from their rough lives. They adopted a new Republican calendar, which we'll explain in a moment. And in the place of the Catholic Church, they created a new state religion, a new civic religion called the Cult of Reason, where essentially the thing they worshipped was logic and reason and rationalism, a very enlightened way of looking at the world. So, now the Republican calendar, basically the months were no longer going to be the old months that were in the calendar. Instead, you have months that are based on, nature, based on the earth, based on the cycle of the seasons. So you can look over this list and see, where you were born in this system. I think I was born during Messidor, actually. And to represent the idea that they were really kind of creating a whole new world, that France was now moving into a whole new era of its history, they started counting again when the Republic was declared, after the monarchy had been abolished. So, that first year, 1792 to 93, after the monarchy is abolished, is year one, because France's history is beginning all over again with this new calendar. Now, people didn't love this calendar, though, because there's not as many festivals, not as many celebrations, and the work week, basically because this was, meant to be a more enlightened scientific calendar, rather than having messy 7-day weeks, where you would have Sunday off. Instead, we have nice even 10-day weeks with 9 working days and 1 day off. So you can imagine, how people reacted to that. Now, cathedrals and churches were renamed and rededicated to reason, to rationalism, to the Enlightenment, rather than to Christianity. In some cases, they destroyed, Christian icons. But there was kind of a resistance to this as well, because some people tried to preserve their Catholic cathedrals and churches even after these orders had been sent out. So, people would go to festivals or go to sit in these temples of reason and hear sermons about the Enlightenment, about, this new sort of path forward that France was taking. So it was all very alien to a lot of people in France and very off-putting. And once again, it kind of deepened this divide between the countryside, which tended to be more conservative, I guess you could say, and the cities. Now, in the middle of 1793, though, the radical government that had been in power for a few months, they'd already undertaken these enormous changes and met with a lot of resistance. So, something happens that kind of sends the government over the edge. In July 1793, Jean-Paul Marat, the newspaper publisher that we talked about in the last lecture, he had a bad sort of skin condition, like some kind of eczema. So when it was really bad, he wouldn't leave his house. He would sit in his bathtub in like a medicated bath and work on his newspapers and take visitors and basically do his work from the bathtub. So, in July 1793, Charlotte Corday, a young woman from the countryside, from outside of Paris, she was someone who was increasingly becoming anti-revolutionary and certainly anti the radical steps that the government was now taking under the leadership of guys like Robespierre. And she looked at Marat as basically a big part of the problem. He was a propagandist. He was someone who advocated for these more radical measures that the government was taking. So Charlotte Corday decides, I have no choice but to take matters into my own hands and do something about this. So she goes to Paris, goes to Marat's house, talks her way into his bathroom, through his butler, through his servants and his associates in the house, and stabs him to death in his bathtub, assassinates Jean-Paul Marat, the voice of the people. She's arrested, and she is not remorseful. She's like, I needed to do this for the good of France and for the good of the revolution, for the good of the people of France, to make sure that we don't go too far and ruin everything that we've won so far. So, in the aftermath of this, now you have a real shift. So the National Convention appoints a new committee called the Committee of Public Safety, which is once again led by Robespierre, Danton, and another of Robespierre's young associates, Louis Saint-Just. So the Committee of Public Safety is basically a sort of special executive, and almost like an inquisition, like, the Spanish monarchy used to have with the Catholic Church, where their job, they were given the task by the National Convention of essentially, investigating and just fighting back against anti-revolutionary activity or counter-revolutionary activity within France. And they were basically given a lot of freedom to do as they pleased in order to, deal with the threat. So Charlotte Corday assassinating Marat, this was something that was looked at as counter-revolutionary and just the sort of thing that they needed to fight against. So, for 1 year, while the Committee of Public Safety is sitting, this is when France enters the Reign of Terror, where, in that one single year, around 40,000 Frenchmen, all across the country, from all social groups, will be executed by the guillotine. Basically as retribution, as punishment for being counter-revolutionary or anti-revolutionary. And really, no one is safe. Now, Robespierre, he argued that, this was necessary. That in order for virtue to win, for goodness and equality and liberty and fraternity among all citizens to win, extreme measures had to be taken. and that until the last counter-revolutionary was gone and no longer a threat, these are the steps that needed to be done. And Robespierre thought that he was the one who had the guts to do what it took to protect the Republic of virtue and avoid having it corrupted, the way that the monarchy had corrupted France. So, now, obviously this is something that is not going to go, without a response. So out in the countryside, now you go from disagreement to open revolt, where aristocrats and Catholic priests and peasants are going to kind of join together in uprisings in the countryside against the central government. And they begin in a part of France called the Vendée. But this becomes a wave of rebellions that the central government is now going to have to put out. These fires from all across France.
Mr. DK, can you please call extension 2000? Mr. DK, can you please call extension 2000? Mr. DK, please call extension 2000.
Okay. Now, so these are rural revolts against central control by the radical government in Paris. Now, eventually, they go too far, and it leads to their own backlash and downfall. So, eventually, the people who are part of the mountain, who are part of the Committee of Public Safety, begin turning on each other and begin becoming suspicious of each other. And Robespierre, in particular, becomes very suspicious of Danton. And he looks at him as someone who isn't totally committed to the Republic of virtue, to, this purification of France the same way that he is. And he actually accuses Danton of speculation, investing in business schemes to try and make money, off of the people of France. So, Danton is arrested and executed. And according to legend, his last words, when he was at the guillotine, he looked up at Robespierre and says, "My only regret is that I will not be alive to see your head get cut off 6 weeks from now." And then, a couple of months later, the National Convention decides that Max Robespierre has gone too far. So, he is arrested and tried and executed along with Sanjou and his other associates. And essentially then, the radical phase of this government is over, because the most extreme, real sort of terrorists within the government are now out of the way. And this happens during the month of Thermidor in the Republican calendar. So now you have this pendulum swing back in the other direction, away from radical government, during the month of Thermidor. So this is a kind of new course for the revolution. So, within the Reign of Terror then, this table or this chart shows you the victims of the Reign of Terror. And you can see it's all different social classes. If you were, even suspected of being an enemy of the revolution, your neighbor or somebody might inform on you, you would be investigated, you would be executed. And the guillotine went from being the sort of symbol of enlightened, humane execution to being a symbol of terror and violence and, a sort of reckless abandon. So once again then, nobles, including those who fled France and had come back to join in the Vendée revolts, they get executed. And in England, this is the moment when the revolution really becomes a serious threat to the stability of other countries as well. And you start to see other countries, even those that might have been sympathetic to a more sort of liberal government, even England, they turn against the revolution. And this is an English political cartoon, The Radicals' Coat of Arms. Here are some French sans-culottes, some French radicals from Paris. Dirty, disgusting, poor, drunken people with a guillotine where they're setting the world on fire and destroying it. And here are some crowns, the Bible, church paraphernalia. Basically, these people are just burning the world to the ground. So, now, it also became a fashion statement then in France, among those who were critical of the radical government, for women to cut their hair short. Because when you went to the guillotine, if you had long hair, they would cut your hair short so the blade could go right through your neck a little more cleanly. So if you were someone who was upset about how far the radical government had gone during the Reign of Terror, then you might cut your hair short on purpose as a show of defiance, to show, like, look, you know just from my hair that I'm someone who, if they found out what I believed in, I'd be on the guillotine as well. And the Vendée revolts, of course, these began out in the countryside and just grew. So it became this kind of game of whack-a-mole, where the government in Paris, the National Convention, had to send the army out, to send out the National Guard to put down these uprisings before they spread too far. And then finally, of course, Robespierre was executed in 1794. There's his head right there. And yeah. So, test your knowledge about the radical phase. What were the National Convention, the Committee of Public Safety at the Mountain? How did France change under the leadership of the radical government between 1792 to 94? And why did France go to war against Europe? How did the war alter the course of the revolution? So, I'll see you in class.